Good morning once again, Coffee Chat friend. I wanted to talk today a little bit about this and other verses. Privileges versus rights. Why would I want to talk about this? Well, I don't know about you, but I've been a little bit confused about them at times. Why in some cases are we told we have a privilege, other times we're told we have a right? Is there a difference here? Well, let's just look at where these words come from, first of all, to get a little bit of an idea of their differences, if there is any. A privilege is along the lines of a grant or a commission. In other words, one moment you're allowed to do something, the next moment you're granted permission to do it. So one moment you can't, one moment you can. And this typically applies to one person. That word person is important, but it applies to one. It's an advantage granted. So in other words, you could have two persons standing there. One has the privilege to do this act. The other one doesn't have the privilege to do it. Right? Rights, or right, is along the lines of what is morally correct. That which is morally right, morally a duty, or morally an obligation. It has to do with rule of conduct, according to this. It has to do with just claim. So somebody has the just claim. Let's say they own a house. Well, because they have documents proving that they paid for it, they have the highest claim for having the right to that house. But it also means a privilege, according to this dictionary I was looking up. Now, I would make a note here that in my experience, in a legal sense, I'm talking about a legislative country's legal system sense, there is pretty much no difference fundamentally between a privilege and a right. So when you hear politicos or anybody who is indoctrinated into that, teachers, professors, and books written by and for the political system, talking about rights versus privileges, there's pretty much no difference. It's just maybe a little bit stronger of a privilege when they're talking about right, but there's not really a difference. Now, there's a little bit of difference between a legal and a lawful sense. In a lawful sense, and when I say law, it's that which is laid down, which cannot be changed by somebody's whim. Right? A law is what's laid down and fixed, and it plays no favorites. It applies to somebody who calls themselves queen. A law would be eventually you're going to croak, and no amount of legislation is going to change that. If you jump off a roof, you're going to hit the ground. No amount of legislation is going to change that. Whereas legal has to do with just rules people are making up. Just like if we're playing a game of chess and we decide mutually to change the rules, then that becomes the new legal code for our game. But if it was something lawful, like there's atoms buzzing around inside the little chess pieces, well, we can't change that. That is lawful. That is the law, right? That's what I mean by the distinction. So in a lawful sense, also going back a step here, in a legal sense, there is no recognition of man. In a legal framework, there is no recognition of man. When I say man, I mean men and women. But I like to use the word man because person is not a substitute for man. And human beings, well, there's still man and human being, isn't there? Human. So man by the human race, right? There's no recognition of man in any legal system that's written by man. There can't be because man created it. So that's why persons are in legal systems. But in a lawful sense, there is governance of man in true universal lawful sense. and it can address man. Therefore, there can be real justice. There is no real justice in a so-called criminal justice system, which I like to jokingly say it's called a criminal justice system because it is run by criminals. But that's for another time. When I say justice, I mean a consequence sense or a cause and effect sense. A good example would be is if you and I were to run along the roof of a building and jump off. The cause and effect would be the causation was that we jumped off. The effect would be that we fall down. Universally, we would fall down. At least I don't know how that would be an exception to that rule. Unless maybe a serious updraft of wind, but then that would still be laws of nature affecting that effect, right? Making that effect. So why is this important? Why is it important to talk about things like this for our quality of life? Well, I would say there's basically two reasons. One of them is that working through these sort of things and being able to not just listen to what people are saying, but to be able to analyze what's being said. Not only do we recognize the nonsense in what the vast majority of people are talking about, but we get to know ourselves a little bit more. We get to see, through the analyzation of these things, we get to realize little subtleties. Like, why is it that in no legislation written by man, written by governments of Canada, USA, whatever anybody thinks they live, why is there never any address of any obligation put upon man or men or women? Why is that? Isn't that an important question? Only the privileges, they only don't apply because they have to do with 1 minute you have it, 1 minute you don't. Well, if it's something real, like a human being, you either have it or you don't, by law, right? And that's a distinction. But recognizing this, we get to know ourselves a bit more and go, wow, this is the realer me. The realer me is that which they don't talk about, because they only talk about fictions and try to get us warped into this Alice in Wonderland, fantasy land of a game. Serious game, mind you, but a game where the real players are never talked about, which are us. Now the second reason I would say that this is important is because we can see our lives as being much more predictable. So if we are to live our lives thinking that we are governed by privileges and so-called rights under the guise of privileges, rights that we're told by supervisors and what have you have the right to do this. Well, if we're to live our lives with that, our lives become very unpredictable because we don't know. We never know what's right. I mean, or because 1 minute this is right, the next minute it's not right. 1 minute we have this right or this privilege, the next minute we don't have that right. Or 10 people standing over there, some of them have the right and some of them don't, because of certain papers that they're carrying or whatever. That's extremely unpredictable. And it pits us against one another because there's no universality, right? Whereas when we know that real justice applies to all, and it's based on law, real law, we can begin to see the world almost through different glasses, begin to know ourselves more. We begin to see, oh yeah, that's why that happened. It took a while, but because of all these things that I did, that affected where I am today. Because that individual, even though they're complaining about their circumstances, I can see why their circumstances are the way they are. to a greater extent. So more truthfulness, I would say, would come from that, and more predictability. Good and bad are uncomfortable. I mean, if we can see that our situations, as far as our input is concerned, that is, I'm not talking about other inputs, but as far as our inputs are concerned, if we can see that we have had an effect on our lives in a detrimental way, then we can counter that by changing our behaviors, which is not easy. I'm not saying it's easy, and then as a cause and effect result, our lives will change. Coming back then to, no, it's a little bit about misleading title perhaps, privileges versus rights, or rights versus privileges, because in a legal sense there's not a lot of differences, because as you can see through the definitions, after all the little differences, at the end of the one rights says a privilege. So it's just usually a stronger privilege. It's usually perhaps like a legal, constitutionally protected privilege. But nevertheless, it's a privilege because if you're not considered to be part of that constitution, like somebody from across an imaginary line, then that right no longer applies. So that's not law, right? That's just legalism. Whereas real law, cause and effect, applies across the board. And we know this inherently. We know that an inherent law says that if we eat consistently in a certain way, we're going to get fatter. Or if we use our muscles consistently, we're going to get stronger. If we jump off buildings, if we're mean to people, eventually somebody's going to be mean to us. If we're loving and we smile at people and we're helpful, eventually people are going to be loving and smiling and helpful to us. This is law of cause and effect. This is justice. When we understand that, our quality of life can go up so much, because all of a sudden we realize we have input in our lives. And as far as we're concerned, we no longer have to be victims of real law, because we're part of the justice, and we're on the side of the equation that says improvement in the quality of our life experience. Hope this has been helpful. It's been a wonderful experience chatting with you again. My name is Steve. Bye-bye.